Hey, what's going on, everyone? Hope you're having a great day. This is Dean Meadows, and welcome to another episode of Dean's Dialogue. Today, we're going to continue along our journey as we look at the reliability of the New Testament. And before we get to that, just a couple of announcements with regards to Apologia Institute. One of the things that we like to do is we like to keep people informed about what's going on with us, where we are, what we're doing, some of the projects that we're working on. And what's really cool is that for a lot of you out there you that are watching this or listening to me on the podcast, you guys have heard of Ralph Gilmore. And Dr. Ralph Gilmore is a professor at Freed Hardeman. He's debated, Dr. Price. He's debated Alex Rosenberg at Ohio State. And what's really cool is that in the fall, we're going to start a monthly podcast with Ralph Gilmore called Reasoning with Ralph, where we're going to talk, about issues in apologetics. And so one of the things that we need from you guys is that if you have a question or something that's pressing on your mind with regards to faith, with regards to apologetics, with regards to, those topics, go ahead and write those in, send them to me. My email is dean@apologiainstitute.com. And what we're basically going to do is we'll set the first episode as the foundation about, hey, why is apologetics important? Why does the church need apologetics? Why do you need apologetics? But then from there, we're basically going to take those questions that you send in and we're going to walk through those together. So that's really exciting. If you don't know that, well, now you do. And if you want more information about what's going on, go to our website, www.apologiainstitute.com. And when you first go on the website, you'll have a little thing that pops up, and you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter. And that way you can stay in touch with what's going on with the members of the organization as a whole. So, as we talked about last week, or not last week, days run together. As we talked about on Monday, we kind of set the foundation for how we got to where we are with regards to New Testament skepticism in the culture. All that stuff comes out of the Enlightenment. The guy that's most known for that, I guess, is David Hume and Hume's skepticism of miracles. And then we kind of talked about how the church needs to respond to that. And one of the things that we mentioned is that, hey, we can't pretend like these objections don't exist. We can't pretend like they're not valid because they come from atheists or skeptics or people who don't hold to the Christian worldview. One of the things that we need to do is we need to acknowledge that they exist, and we need to have really good answers for those. And then the second thing we looked at is, hey, I can't compartmentalize my faith, right? I can't say, well, my religious experience is more important than having reasons for why I believe what I believe. And that's really why we're, along this track with regards to the Bible. There are so many people, specifically young adults, who will go off to college. They'll take a class, in New Testament, and all of these objections will be thrown in their face. And because they haven't had that foundation or don't have that foundation, they come away saying, oh man, I just don't know. And they're not sure anymore about their faith. I shared a story like that in the last episode. So we kind of set the foundation. And so one of the things that we're going to do today is we're going to dive right into questions associated with the formation of the Synoptic Gospels, which are the first three books in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the reason that I'm doing this is because they overlap to a great degree in what they share. And so in a later episode, we'll go ahead and we'll look at the Gospel of John independently, because that gospel is very unique, has a lot of different information, and there are just some different objections that are raised with regards to the Gospel of John that are different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so basically today we're going to answer or look at three questions. Who wrote these documents and how do we know it? Are there differences in the chronology of the Synoptic Gospels? What if the names ascribed to these texts uh, aren't really the authors. What follows from that, and what does that do? So once again, uh, if you like to follow us, you can subscribe to the newsletter. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, um, and once again, we appreciate everybody that supports us, whether you've partnered with us financially or whether or not you've continued to pray for the work and the mission um, that that we love. All right, let's dig. So, who wrote the Gospels? What can we actually know about the authors and the settings, of these three books? And so there are two ways to figure this out, and this is what we do when it comes to history as well. And this isn't just significant for the Gospels. This is pretty much any ancient document in antiquity. Um, we'll look at the external evidence and the internal evidence. And the external evidence is referring to that which is outside of the main document. Is there anything written about this document with relation to its authorship that comes from reliable sources? And then we look at the external or the internal evidence, say, hey, as I look into this document, is there anything in this document that says, hey, this is written by Matthew, or hey, hi, I'm Luke and I'm writing this gospel, or hey, it's John Mark and I'm writing the Gospel of Mark. And so that's really the path that we're gonna take in the time that we have together. So as we look at Matthew, as we look at the external evidence from Matthew, we say, all right, is there anything there that suggests that Matthew? Why is the Gospel of Matthew, or the Gospel according to Matthew, ascribed to Matthew? Well, one of the reasons that we can be confident that that's the case is that the Christian writer Papias, a early 2nd century church father, offers the oldest known testimony concerning the Gospel of Matthew. Now, he is quoted by a 4th century church father, historian, Eusebius. And in quoting Papias, Eusebius notes that Matthew wrote his text in Hebrew and that there were those who translated it accordingly. Also from Irenaeus, who's a 2nd century church father. He also is quoted by Eusebius, and Irenaeus affirms that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew. There's also other historical testimony that states that Matthew wrote in the province of Judea from the city of Jerusalem, and he wrote to Jewish Christians. This is supported by Church Father Jerome, who lived from 347 to 429. He says the same thing, that Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew for the Jews. And so there are also much later time frame, probably 1000, 1100, 1200, these imprints on documents that state that Matthew wrote this gospel, but hey, we want to get as close to the source as possible. Not discounting that, but just saying it's not as close to the source as these church fathers. And so when we look at that, there's another question that we have to ask. Is there anybody else mentioned in 1st century Christianity named Matthew that's documented in history? And so the only person that we have, and the only person that we know named Matthew from 1st century Christianity, was a converted tax collector, also known as Levi, who was one of Jesus's closest followers. And so here's the thing about Matthew, and why it's unlikely that someone would ascribe Matthew's name to the gospel to kind of shore up or promote 1st century Orthodox Christianity. Because if you know anything about Matthew from the texts of the Gospels, we know that Matthew wasn't necessarily your average Jewish guy. He was actually probably considered a traitor because he was a tax collector. And so what happened in the 1st century, as the Romans conquered these provinces, and as the Romans basically conquered the world, one of the things that they did specifically with the Jews is they said, hey, basically, you can come collect taxes for us, and here's the tax that we're going to collect. And if you want to overcharge so that you can line your pockets, by all means, go for it, so long as Rome gets her due. And so this was the job that Matthew had. Now, in light of the fact that infant Christianity, the early church, was made up primarily of Jews, if you were going to shore up or promote first century Christianity, you would probably not put the name of a Jewish trader as the author of a gospel. And so the only reason it seems that they would stick to that labeling of the Gospel of Matthew to Matthew, this tax collector, is that if Matthew were actually the author. So that seems to be the reason why Matthew is labeled as the author of Matthew. And also, there's no historical evidence that anyone else wrote the Gospel of Matthew. And so, here's the thing. In order for the skeptic to overturn the historical evidence for the Gospel of Matthew, and Matthew being the author of the Gospel of Matthew, there has to be significant counter evidence rather than just mere speculation, which amounts best to an argument from silence. So make sure that as you're talking to people about the authorship of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that we make that point as well. So moving on to Mark, Papias also refers to Mark as the author of the Gospel of Mark. He states Mark's information was given to him by Peter, that this was accurately recorded by Mark, even though it's not necessarily chronologically, step by step in sync, right? And so this is significant because when we look at the Gospels, we see that Jesus had 12 disciples, but even within that group of 12, there was an inner circle that Jesus had, and it was James, it was John, and it was Peter. So if Mark is getting his information from Peter, he's getting his information from someone who is an eyewitness, and not just a close associate, but a inner associate of Peter, which is great information to have if you want to write a biography about Jesus. Also, Justin Martyr, who's a 2nd century church father, quotes Papias as well, noting that Mark's gospel came from Peter. And something new that I found, which is interesting, was that there's a tradition, noted by Eusebius, that when Mark told Peter of his writing plan, Peter neither prevented it or encouraged the undertaking. And so this is kind of like a fairly half-hearted approval that doesn't seem like it would be invented if it were fictitious. So the point that I'm raising there is that Eusebius records that, hey, Mark actually wrote this gospel, and the reason that we know he wrote this gospel is because he told Peter about it, and Peter wasn't. It seems like Peter was never like, "Oh, awesome, you should do that," or "Man, you really shouldn't do that." And so it could have been the situation where Mark said, "Hey, I want to write this account. I'm going to use the information that you've given me," or "Hey, I need this information from you." And the point that I'm raising is that it seems like, based upon the historical evidence, that conversation actually took place. And that way we can know that Mark was the author of the gospel because he had this conversation with Peter. So it seems also most likely that this Mark that's mentioned is John Mark, from the book of Acts. Also, it seems that he was in Rome with Peter in 1 Peter 5:13. And the other thing about John Mark is that he's most known for deserting Paul and Barnabas. So given that Mark is mostly known for deserting Paul and Barnabas and isn't really viewed as a, how would I put it, a significant character during the infancy of the church. It wouldn't make sense to ascribe his name to a gospel. Once again, if someone was trying to say, hey, who can we put on this document that'll garner us the most spotlight, that'll garner Christianity the most attention to promote early Christianity? Same kind of same reason why Matthew wouldn't be. It's not like Matthew, the tax collector, the Jewish trader, draws a lot of attention to early first century Jews to read this document. Does it seem like the deserter of Paul and Barnabas would garner a lot of attention either? And the question we have to ask is, if that's the case, then why stick with it? And it seems the most reasonable explanation is because he's actually the author of the book. Now, when we come to Luke and we look at external evidence for Luke, um, unfortunately, Luke has the least amount of information written about him in regards to external evidence. We're told that Luke operates in the region around Achaia, the southern half of the Greek peninsula, and wrote particularly to Gentile believers. We're also told that Luke was originally from Antioch of Syria, and this information primarily comes from Eusebius. And the same reason that Mark, not that Luke was a deserter, but because Luke isn't necessarily a significant figure in early first century Christianity, not really a big figure in the Gospels, not really a big figure seen by name in the book of Acts. It seems like, hey, they would have to have really good reasons for having Luke as the author and not just, hey, let's slap somebody on this gospel that'll give us a lot of attention. And we see, and this is going to be later episodes, but we see this a lot, after, second century, or excuse me, late second century, third century, fourth century, we see these Gnostic texts that come into play. And you'll see things like the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas. And the reason that those names are ascribed to those Gnostic Gospels and forgeries is because they want people to read it, because they want the credibility of the document to be associated with someone that was actually a follower. Now, we know that those are forgeries, and we know that those are not the earliest documents. And I only say that because it's not as though I'm simply making this up as we go along. That if you're gonna put Luke's name on there, it certainly wouldn't be to be like hold up a sign and say popular person, significant person in early first century Christianity on the same level as, say, Peter or James or the Apostle John. What else do we know about Luke as far as external evidence? Irenaeus notes that Luke was a close companion of Paul. Justin Martyr alludes to the fact that Luke wrote the gospel, and I think that that's good historical evidence for Luke being the author of Luke. So we've covered external evidence for Matthew, we've covered external evidence for Mark, we've covered external evidence for Luke. So now let's go ahead and transition into internal evidence. Remember, internal evidence is looking at the document and saying, all right, is there anything in this document that points to Matthew, Mark, and Luke writing this book? Now, here's the thing. We don't have early evidence for that. It seems like, later down the line, we start coming across these manuscripts that have been copied that have these names associated with them. And I think that's because of the church history that follows. However, there's a good reason for that, I think. I think one of the reasons is that the first communities to which each of these documents was written would have known the origin of the document sent to them from the Christian courier who is assigned to deliver the message. And that was the custom of the day. So only when more than one gospel, or even all four, I'll include John in this too, only when one or more of the gospels were in circulation together would the need to distinguish one from the other be essential. And so we shouldn't be alarmed by this. I mean, it was a common thing during the day. Plutarch is credited with, something like over 40 biographies, yet his name doesn't appear on the vast majority of them. But there are a lot of people that ascribe his name to these biographies. Why? Word of mouth, courier, people receiving it, they would have known that this was a work of Plutarch. So here's the other thing. Why? One of the questions that I get asked a lot is, why is the chronology different between Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Once again, John, and I'll even include John in this actually. I won't separate him out from here, from this discussion. Why are the chronologies different? It seems like one of the things that I get is, it seems like if these people were writing about the same person, then why is it all not in the same order? Well, number one, Greco-Roman biographies don't operate that way. But two, there are also specific audiences and specific purposes and specific aspects of the life of Jesus that these authors have, right? So for Matthew, because he's writing to a Jewish group of people, what he's going to do is he's going to use a lot of Jewish quotations. He's going to appeal to the Jewish culture, and he's going to appeal to the things that would have been important to the Jews with regards to the coming Messiah. This is why Matthew quotes more Old Testament passages than Mark and Luke and John, because he's trying to build the case that Jesus is the prophesied Messiah to come. Whereas Luke doesn't have a lot of that. And the reason that he doesn't have a lot of that, it seems, is because he's writing to a Gentile audience as well. John states his purpose towards the end of his gospel, that he records the miracles of Jesus, so that by recording the miracles of Jesus, the person who would read that would have belief in Jesus as the Son of God, would have belief in Jesus as the Messiah, and in having belief in Jesus and becoming a convert of Christianity, would have eternal life. So those are the reasons why the chronology of these events are different for each of the four Gospels, and definitely in those areas that are different in the Synoptics. So that answers that question. But what about the big question? One of the questions that I often get is this, hey, what if you're wrong about who wrote these? And what if the Synoptic Gospels aren't written by Matthew, aren't written by Mark, aren't written by Luke? And so one of the things that we need to do when we are assessing objections to Christianity is this. We need to take the objection seriously, like I've said before, but we also need to ask, okay, what's the worst possible thing that would follow from this objection? And so let's do that with this objection. Let's say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I'll even include John, don't author these books, don't author these letters. What's the worst thing that follows? The only thing that follows is that they aren't the ones who wrote the Gospels. They aren't the ones who wrote the book. Now, I believe that they did. I think we have good historical evidence. But even if they didn't, it's not as if the skeptic has this powerful argument against the reliability of the New Testament, because all they've shown is that, hey, church historians and church fathers, got it wrong. What they haven't shown is that the information inside the Gospels are inaccurate or that are not reliable. So even if they didn't write these, the skeptic still has to show that the information within these Gospels is wrong, is not accurate. So they would still have to show something like um, Jesus wasn't a historical figure. They'd still have to show something like the resurrection didn't happen. They'd still have to show something like, um, hey, this conversation or this place over here didn't actually exist, or this thing here didn't actually happen. They'd still have to do a historical investigation and show that the Gospels are not reliable history. And so let's not freak out about that, okay? Let's, number one, let's assert the historical evidence and make them show that these aren't the authors. But worst case scenario, even if these guys did not author the Gospels, does not do anything to any of the core doctrines, precepts, or the historical reliability of the New Testament. So that's really it. That's the show. I hope that this was informative. And once again, you can watch it here as many times as you want on Facebook, on YouTube. And hey, if you have any questions about the first two episodes that we looked at, send me an email. I think what we'll do for Friday is, we'll kind of recap the first two episodes of at least the reliability of the New Testament, and we'll go ahead and we'll answer some questions, about that. So once again, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for watching. Tune in Friday for the next episode. We'll answer some questions that people have raised about what we've talked about. And, hey, thank you so much for the prayers. Thank you so much for those who have partnered with us financially. And hey, spread the word. We love you guys. We want to see people who are lost, saved, people who have left Christianity return. And we want to equip you to engage culture. Thank you so much. Have a great day. God bless.